Hello students, in this video we will discuss part 2 of the essay Caribbean Literature and its Criteria by Edward Camus Brathwaite. In this portion of the essay, Brathwaite writes a brief biographical sketch where he writes about his education and how he ended up in Ghana. During his stay in Ghana, Brathwaite realized that he had to free himself from the model of colonial authority. He talks about the sonnet form specifically and says that it is a very restrictive form, and a writer from Caribbean should consciously select those forms that are most suitable for his specific Caribbean experience. Towards the end of the essay, he gives several criterion or characteristic features of Caribbean literature. So this portion begins where Brathwaite says that he had read Patterson's work in 1963 when he first came to Jamaica. And he mentions that he had started to write sometime before that. Regarding his education, Brathwaite writes he was born in Barbados and went on a scholarship to a university abroad. He had to select Cambridge University because at that time University of West Indies was not regarded as a place of scholarship where somebody like him would pursue his education. At University of West Indies, they were still narrowly confined to the Prosperian concept of education, he writes. And when he was studying at Cambridge, he thought he would be accepted as an Englishman because of his education and that his critics would have read his poetry. But he was quickly disillusioned. Though his name was an English name, they did not accept him as an Englishman. He realized that there was a discrepancy between the name and appearance. He also found that the editors had a personal bias in their selections. The editors decided what kind of poetry Brathwaite ought to be writing. They thought he should be writing on poetry on King Kong, Gorilla, Tarzan, etc. They could not accept Brathwaite because of their own prejudices. So, Brathwaite writes he could not continue as a poet in Britain. After the completion of his education, Brathwaite did not want to return to Caribbean because he was too convinced that it was a place where the writers could not live in. So he applied for various jobs outside the Caribbean, but he was rejected by many of his employers because they were prejudiced towards Caribbean. They thought that he may be drinking too much of alcohol or his English was not good. Sometimes he did not get any reply to his job applications. Finally, he got a job in Ghana, and that is how he ended up there. In Ghana, he says, started the process of de-education. Regarding his journey, he says, unlike his ancestors who came from Africa, went to England and came back to Caribbean, he had gone from Caribbean to England and then to Africa. So he says no West Indian had been doing this. In Ghana, he learned what culture meant and what home meant, and he equates them both. it gave him an idea that rootlessness was not the final concern of creative poetry, and no matter how much you move, you have to be rooted to have somewhere to start. Africa taught him that before this happened, he had to de educate himself and he had to free himself from the model of colonial authority. As a writer, one had to free oneself from the tyranny of the sonnet, from such structures as makes it almost impossible for one to think originally. You can select an image, but the selection of the image is not enough. It is the form in which that image is expressed begins to free you and makes it possible for you to understand what is happening. So, the form of literature is more important. It should not be restrictive as a sonnet is. It should liberate one. That is what Brathwaite feels. Brathwaite gives an example to explain what he means by the tyranny of the sonnet. In poetry, he says, the presiding rhythm is the iambic pentameter. What this pentameter does is an archetype of Europe's own Missilic and military achievements. It defines certain personality and beautifully expresses that personality, but it excludes naturally cultures and cultural expressions which do not conform to it. So, English poetry may be beautiful, the form of sonnet may be extraordinary, but it is not suitable to Caribbean experience. Formal English poetry is based on musical structure, on a command structure. It is possible to write poetry based on other musical structures. So, just because this form, the English form, exists, we need not follow that form only. There are other forms also which a writer can select. There are a large variety of musical structures in the Caribbean, which, as we begin to use them, opens up all sorts of expressions that depart from that tyrannic mode. Just if we investigate, we will find many different forms which a Caribbean writer can make use of, and that gives him several opportunities or avenues to be a creative writer. As a result, Barthwaite is using a critical system which is using terms of critical value different from European model. Brathwaite says he uses firstly music and rhythm as critical concept as an approach to analyze poetry. The second category is kinesis and possession. Kinesis is a term which refers to the use of energy. It is a term that comes from African religious culture where worship is best expressed in kinetic energy. Now, we can see that all African writers give more importance to religious experience, spirituality, etc. The idea is that the more energy you can accumulate and express, the nearer you will come to God. God is attracted towards man through the energy that man is ready to use, the controlled energy, the nature of that energy, and the force of that energy, so that there is a whole series of literary works which attempt an analog to religious experience. There is poetry which attempts to use energies in a way similar to the Odin. It attempts to capture a sense of divinity to enter into a state of possession. So, this type of religious poetry is one form of writing in Caribbean literature. It attempts to capture a sense of divinity. So that is one of the categories. And Brathwaite says possession becomes an important idea because the people of the Caribbean are dispossessed. They have a strong sense of dispossession and fragmentation because of the nature of history, the nature of geography of the region. All these areas were colonized, so they have lost their sense of culture and tradition and suffer from fragmentation and alienation. So dispossession is very much part of being of a Caribbean. So possession becomes an equally important concept. He says, I am using the concept of kindnesses to make us aware of the things that we do possess, what is important, what is significant or beautiful in our culture. So, to refer to that, Brathwaite uses the term kindnesses. The people who write the poetry of kindnesses actually in themselves enact a religious process whereby they become aware of certain omens and certain icons that are vital to themselves. So, according to Brathwaite, the two important aspects of poetry are first one music rhythm and second one kinesis possession. This may lead to notion of genesis, he says. The notion of genesis or the origin of things, poetry that describes the way that the islands were formed, a form of writing similar to a flower, a sense of convolution of things curling upon themselves and then spreading outward. So this kind of genesis poetry or literature, according to Brathwaite, is also a possible criterion that you can observe in Caribbean writing. Then he says nation language, that is an important concept as far as Brathwaite is concerned. By nation or national language, he means use of local language as distinct from standard English. This refers not to the political nation but to the cultural nation, the nation of the native. So, the use of local language, the dialects, is important according to Brathwaite as far as Caribbean literature is concerned. Then he says the concept of icon, the object that comes out of meditation, the object that is concretized and comes to represent a symbol. The use of ancestors has become an important symbol or icon in Caribbean literature. Then finally, he talks about the poetry of voyage that is there in Caribbean literature. It need not be a physical voyage or traveling from one place to another, but the voyage or the travel or journey is a metaphysical, metaphorical voyage which is commonly found in Caribbean literature. So, here, as we conclude, Brathwaite makes a certain note of these critical concepts, which are music and rhythm, kinesis and possession, national language, icon, and voyage. Thank you.